You wake up one morning and realize something terrifying. Not that you failed, not that life was unfair, but that years have passed and you never truly began. Not really. You planned. You waited. You prepared. You thought about changing your life 1,000 times. But somewhere between responsibility, exhaustion, and fear, you became a spectator in your own existence. And the painful part is, most people never notice this happening until it's too late. You don't have to be great to start, but you have to start to be great. It sounds simple, almost too simple, but hidden inside that sentence is a truth most adults spend decades avoiding. Because starting is not a practical problem, it's a psychological war. And for many people watching this tonight, that war has already lasted years. There's a certain kind of tiredness that sleep doesn't fix. People rarely talk about it. You see it in men sitting silently in parked cars before going inside their homes. You see it in exhausted mothers staring into space after everyone falls asleep. You see it in workers scrolling their phones late at night, searching for something they can't name. It's not physical fatigue. It's the exhaustion of carrying unrealized potential. The weight of becoming someone you no longer recognize. And eventually, people stop dreaming loudly, not because they don't want more from life, but because disappointment repeated enough times slowly becomes identity. That's the dangerous part. Human beings adapt to emotional pain faster than they realize. A person can adjust to loneliness, adjust to mediocrity, adjust to quiet misery. They can normalize waking up every day feeling emotionally disconnected from their own life. And once suffering becomes familiar, starting feels threatening. Because starting means confronting something most people spend years avoiding. The possibility that they wasted time. Time. No one warns you how fast it disappears once adulthood begins. At 20, a year feels endless. At 40, months disappear like smoke. At 60, people begin replaying memories more than imagining futures. And somewhere along the way, life becomes maintenance. Pay the bills, handle responsibilities, take care of everyone else, survive the week, repeat. Days blend together so quietly that one morning you look in the mirror and wonder where your younger self went. Not physically, spiritually. What happened to the version of you that once believed life could become something meaningful? What happened to the ambition, the curiosity, the hunger? Most people think motivation disappears because they got older. That's not true. Motivation disappears when people repeatedly betray themselves. Every promise you make to yourself and don't keep changes your identity. I'll start next month. I'll get healthy later. I'll write the book someday. I'll leave this miserable situation eventually. Eventually. One of the most dangerous words in the human language. Because eventually makes people feel hopeful, while quietly stealing their lives. The strange thing about regret is that it rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates slowly, like dust gathering in an abandoned room. A little every year. The career you never pursued. The conversation you never had. The risk you never took. The life you secretly wanted but never gave yourself permission to build. And the older people become, the more they confuse stability with peace. But they are not the same thing. A person can have stability and still feel emotionally dead inside. That's why some people reach the goals they once prayed for and still feel empty. Because achievement without alignment creates quiet despair. And deep down, many adults know this. They feel it during silent drives at night, during birthdays that no longer feel exciting, during moments when everyone around them is laughing, but internally they feel distant from everything. There's a grief that comes from becoming functional instead of alive. Jim Rohn once said that suffering is part of life, but unnecessary suffering comes from neglect. And neglect rarely looks dramatic in the beginning. It looks harmless. Skipping one workout, delaying one dream, ignoring one instinct, choosing comfort one more time. That's how people slowly disappear. Not through catastrophe, through repetition. Behavioral psychology calls this identity reinforcement. Every repeated action becomes evidence. When you avoid difficult things repeatedly, your brain starts building a self-image around avoidance. You no longer say, "I avoided this." You begin believing, "I'm just not disciplined. I'm not confident. I'm too old. I'm too far behind." But identity is not discovered. It's constructed, quietly, daily, painfully. And here's the hidden truth most people never realize. Starting is not about achievement. It's about interrupting the identity of helplessness. That's why the first step feels emotionally violent, not physically difficult, emotionally difficult. Because when someone has lived in hesitation for years, action creates internal conflict. The mind resists change even when the current life feels unbearable. Human beings are strangely loyal to familiar suffering. A man may stay in a job he hates for 20 years because uncertainty feels more dangerous than misery. Someone may remain emotionally numb because vulnerability feels terrifying. A person may continue destroying their health because discipline forces them to confront how far they've fallen. People don't avoid growth because growth is hard. They avoid growth because growth threatens identity. And identity is where the real battle lives. Maybe that's why so many people wait for motivation before changing. They think transformation begins with inspiration, but it rarely does. Real transformation usually begins in exhaustion. A quiet moment, late at night, when life becomes impossible to ignore anymore. Not dramatic, just painfully honest. You sit there realizing, if I continue living like this, nothing changes. And suddenly the future feels terrifying. Because most people are not haunted by failure. They're haunted by repetition. The fear that next year will feel exactly like this year. The fear that 10 years from now, they'll still be explaining to themselves why they never started. That fear changes people. Not instantly, but deeply. There's a scene that quietly happens in millions of lives every day. Someone decides to change. Not publicly. No announcement. No motivational speech. No dramatic transformation montage. Just a private decision. They wake up earlier. Take a walk. Read 10 pages. Apply for the opportunity. Write one paragraph. Save a little money. Say no to something destructive. Tiny actions. Almost invisible. But psychologically, something massive has happened. They interrupted the cycle. And most people underestimate how powerful that is. Because greatness is rarely built through intensity. It's built through consistency, surviving emotion. Anyone can feel inspired for one day. But the people who slowly transform their lives learn how to continue after the emotion disappears. That's the real difference. Not talent, not intelligence, not luck. Emotional endurance. The ability to act while uncertain. The ability to continue while unseen. The ability to remain committed without immediate reward. That's rare. And rarity creates transformation. Stoic philosophers understood something modern culture keeps forgetting. Your life is shaped less by what you feel, and more by what you repeatedly tolerate. If you tolerate excuses, your future shrinks. If you tolerate disrespect, your self-worth deteriorates. If you tolerate stagnation, your spirit slowly weakens. And over time, people become emotionally exhausted not because life is hard, but because they abandon themselves too many times. That abandonment creates internal shame. Not loud shame, quiet shame. The kind that appears when you look at people living courageously and wonder what happened to you. The kind that appears when you remember who you once wanted to become. The kind that follows people into middle age. Not because they lack potential, but because they kept postponing their own life. And the tragedy is, many people think it's too late. At 35, at 45, at 60, They believe time disqualified them. But wisdom often arrives later precisely because suffering deepened them. A younger person may have energy, but an older person carries awareness. And awareness changes everything. Because eventually you realize something shocking. Nobody is coming to rescue your life. Not motivation, not luck, not perfect timing. There is no magical future version of yourself arriving to fix everything. There is only this moment, this ordinary day, this exhausted version of you deciding whether the story continues the same way or not. That realization can feel brutal, but strangely, it's also freeing. Because once you stop waiting for perfect conditions, you finally begin. And beginning changes something spiritual inside a person. Not instantly, but subtly. The first workout doesn't transform your body. The first honest conversation doesn't heal your relationships. The first disciplined week doesn't rebuild your life. But it rebuilds something even more important. Self-respect. And self-respect is powerful. Because people who respect themselves differently, walk differently, speak differently, make decisions differently. They stop needing constant validation. They stop negotiating with destructive habits. They stop abandoning themselves for temporary comfort. Not because life became easier, but because they became stronger internally. There's another truth people rarely admit. Discipline is deeply emotional. People think discipline is about schedules and routines. But often, discipline is grief. Grief for wasted years. Grief for neglected potential. Grief for becoming someone you never intended to become. And that grief can either destroy a person or awaken them. Some people numb themselves forever. Others finally decide, no more. That decision is quiet, but life-changing. Because every meaningful transformation begins invisibly. Roots grow underground long before trees become visible. And human transformation works the same way. At first, nobody notices your growth. Sometimes not even you. But slowly, your mind changes. Your standards change. Your energy changes. You become less attracted to distraction, less interested in proving yourself, less willing to betray your future for temporary relief. That's maturity, not age. Awareness. The world constantly glorifies dramatic success stories. But real life is rarely dramatic. Real life is repetitive. And that's exactly why most people fail to change. They underestimate the psychological importance of ordinary days. A man ruins his future quietly. A man rebuilds his future quietly too. In tiny decisions nobody applauds. Choosing discipline when exhausted. Remaining patient when results are invisible. Continuing after embarrassment. Trying again after failure. That's where identity shifts. Not in huge moments. In repeated moments. There's something deeply human about wanting proof before beginning. People want certainty, guarantees, validation. But certainty is often the reward for action, not the prerequisite. Confidence comes after evidence, not before. That's why waiting to feel ready becomes a trap. Because readiness is often created through movement. The first conversation feels awkward. The first attempt feels embarrassing. The first steps feel small. But every person you admire once stood at the exact same beginning. Unknown, uncertain, imperfect. The difference is, they started before they believed in themselves fully. Most people wait for belief, but action creates belief. And maybe that's what this quote truly means. You don't have to be great to start, but you have to start to be great. It isn't really about greatness. It's about permission. Permission to begin imperfectly. Permission to struggle publicly. Permission to grow slowly. Because adulthood teaches people to hide weakness. But hidden weakness becomes permanent weakness. Growth requires exposure, humility, failure, and most importantly, repetition. The person you want to become is not created through one giant breakthrough. They are created through thousands of ordinary decisions repeated long enough to become identity. One day, if you continue long enough, you notice something strange. The life that once felt impossible starts feeling normal. You become calmer, more disciplined, more emotionally grounded, not because suffering disappeared, but because you stopped running from yourself. That changes everything. Peace is not found in avoiding difficulty. Peace is found in becoming someone capable of facing difficulty without collapsing internally. And that kind of strength cannot be purchased, cannot be faked, cannot be inherited. It must be built quietly, patiently, painfully. The older you get, the more you realize life is less about proving yourself to the world and more about becoming someone you can respect in silence. Someone who keeps promises. Someone who continues despite fear. Someone who no longer hides behind excuses. That's greatness. Not fame, not money, not status. Alignment. A peaceful relationship with yourself. And strangely, that journey begins the moment you stop demanding perfection from your first step. Tonight, millions of people will once again postpone their lives. They'll tell themselves, tomorrow, next month, when things calm down, when I have more confidence, when I have more money, when I'm less afraid. But life keeps moving, silently, relentlessly, and eventually, people realize the cost of waiting was far greater than the cost of starting imperfectly. That realization breaks some people, but it awakens others. So if you're listening to this in a quiet room, or during another sleepless night, or after another exhausting day where you pretended everything was fine, understand this. You are not behind because you failed. You feel behind because part of you knows you were meant to become more than this. And that feeling, that discomfort, that restlessness, may actually be the healthiest thing left inside you. Because numb people don't ache for change. People who still feel the pain, still have something alive within them. Maybe you don't need a complete reinvention tonight. Maybe you don't need perfect clarity. Maybe you only need one honest beginning. One decision that interrupts the cycle. One small act of self-respect. One moment where you stop abandoning your future. That's how transformation begins. Not loudly, quietly, like sunrise appearing over a dark city no one believed would see light again. Years from now, you probably won't remember the exact day everything changed. Because transformation rarely feels cinematic while it's happening. It feels ordinary, almost disappointingly ordinary. But one day you look back and realize the small decision to begin saved your life, not physically, spiritually. And maybe that's the greatest tragedy of all. Most people never discover who they could have become because they were too afraid to start imperfectly. Don't let that become your story. The clock is moving whether you act or not. The question is no longer whether you're capable of greatness. The real question is, how much longer are you willing to remain a stranger to your own potential?